Hello and welcome to Reportage. This is Danish bin Nabi. In today's segment of Reportage, I have an interesting book on Kashmir titled Dark Secrets, Politics, Intrigue and the Proxy War in Kashmir by Iqbal Chand Malhotra. To discuss about this book, I have with me Mr. Malhotra. Let's listen into him. Mr. Malhotra, explain to me what was the need of writing such an intriguing book?
Well, Danish, the need for writing such an intriguing book has already been explained in the introduction to the book. But let me just recall that in 2014, Discovery Channel commissioned me to do a film on the line of control. And I began to do my research on Kashmir. And then a year later, they asked me to do a film on the Siachen Glacier. And then I added to my body of research. And thereafter, Times Now asked me to do a series of 6 films on Kashmir, which basically outlined the history. That was in 2017, and those films were submitted to them in 2018. And then my friend Maruf Raza came up with the idea that let's write a book together on, because he was helping me, in the research on all of these films. So he said, let's write a book together, and we got a commission from Bloomsbury to write a book called Kashmir's Untold Story Declassified. But what happened is that there was a lot of material that was being discovered as a result of the research. And when I went into that, I found out that there was a wide body of material on Aksai Chin, which we had not referred to in our previous book. So I got a commission from Bloomsbury to write a book on China, Red Fear, the China Threat, which basically looks at the Aksai Chin region and why the invasion of Aksai Chin took place. And when I submitted that book, at that time, it was a Corona period, and it was launched in August of 2020. Thereafter, I continued my research, and I found there was some more material that was thrown up. And then, of course, there was this Galwan issue of why the Chinese army came into Eastern Ladakh. And thereafter, I decided to write this other book, Dark Secrets. And now, in fact, next month, my new book is coming out, which is basically not linked to Kashmir, but it's about the Pakistani nuclear program and how they funded it and how they financed it.
It's coming in July.
Yes, on the 18th of July, it's going to be reduced. It's called The Bomb, the Bank, the Mullah, and the Poppies. It's basically about how Mullah Omar was put up by the Pakistanis, and he used to work for one of the biggest drug dealers in Afghanistan, and he was the preacher in a very small mosque, and how he was brought into the limelight, selected by President
Mr. Malhotra, we will have a separate program for that book. Let's come back to this. Let's come back to this book first, Dark Secrets. You have said in your book, you have written in your book that British advanced actually the date of partition only to safeguard their interests in Gilgit. Kindly throw some light on it. What was actually happening in Gilgit?
You see, around 1935, the government of India persuaded Maharaja Hari Singh to sequester Gilgit from his kingdom and his political control and give it on deeds to the government of India. Now, what had happened was that uranium was discovered in Xinjiang, which is adjacent to Gilgit. And Gilgit and the 7 other smaller principalities like Hunza, Chitral, etc. Now, with the discovery of uranium, the British had set up a spy network out of Gilgit to actually also get the samples of uranium ore, because the world was all working towards building a nuclear bomb. The Americans were doing that, the Russians were doing that, Germans were doing that during World War II. And they then discovered that, we not only need the bomb, but we also need the uranium, and we also need the technology that the Russians are employing to build the nuclear bomb. So they had a big spying setup, and then they had set up these seismic and acoustic monitoring stations in Gilgit. Now, Gilgit was under the direct control of the government of India till 31st of July 1947, either 30th or 31st of July. And the presumption was that Mr. Ramchandra Kak, who was the Prime Minister of the erstwhile Kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir, had succeeded in persuading the Maharaja to merge with Pakistan. But what happened is that Pandit Nehru sent Mahatma Gandhi to meet the Maharaja. And after he met the Maharaja, he convinced the Maharaja that, look, you'll be better off if you join India rather than you join Pakistan, because it has an uncertain future. So the Maharaja then dismissed Chandrakars. And after he dismissed Chandrakars, the action started. Because you see, the British, because of the Indian National Army during the Second World War and the defection of around 40,000 Indian Army soldiers in the Eastern Theatre, that is in Singapore, to the Japanese side, and under the leadership later on of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, the British did not trust the loyalty of the Indian Army, because without the Indian Army, they could not control this Indian subcontinent.
This is 1946 or 1939?
No, this is 1946. I moved forward to 1946-47.
Okay.
And they could not trust the loyalty of the Indian Army, and therefore they had to leave the Indian subcontinent, but they also had to stay on. So then they decided to actually create a mechanism whereby they actually left India, but they stayed on in the state of Pakistan. And the state of Pakistan was actively encouraged, the creation of the state of Pakistan was actively encouraged by the British, and they had quite a bit of foresight and planning that went into it. So this was the reason why the British found Gilgit to be absolutely vital. And they were under the impression that if we return Gilgit to the Maharaja, and because of Chandrakars' decision, the state will merge with Pakistan, and therefore we will have Gilgit under our control. But that did not happen, and the Maharaja opted to remain independent on 15th August 1947. So therefore, the British then had to ensure that Gilgit came under their legal control, and therefore they were planning this invasion of the Qabilis on the one side, because they needed physical control over Gilgit, that region, and the 3 acoustic and seismic monitoring stations that were monitoring the Soviet blasts in the Soviet testing that was going on in Xinjiang. Now the Russians also were running out of uranium in Xinjiang, and they found that the vein of uranium actually extended into Aksai Chin along the side of the Karkash River. Now, nobody talks about the Karkash River, because the Karkash River was a very vital river that still is, that flows from Aksai Chin into Xinjiang, into the Tarim Basin. And in this entire area was full of uranium, and Soviet surveys had discovered that. Now, there was a man called Mr. Bator, who was a Xinjiang Muslim, who was actually leading a rebellion against the Russians. And the Russians did not want to have to deal with him, because what would happen is that then certain, Islamic tendencies or fundamentalism would arise in the Soviet Islamic republics. So they said, let's get a buffer into the picture. And the communists were winning the civil war in China. So in July, August of 1949, they flew 10,000 communist troops into Xinjiang and made them the de facto controllers of Xinjiang, and said, you control Xinjiang. And in 1949, when Mr. Mao Zedong took over China, he was invited to Moscow, and there Stalin told him that, look, you have to now invade Aksai Chin, because we want this uranium. Our uranium processing plant is in Tajikistan, and you have to build a road now from Xinjiang to Aksai Chin, and then it goes back and extends into Tajikistan. So that's basically the broad geopolitical construct of that time. And that is why partition was advanced forward, because the Soviet reactors were going critical, and the bomb testings was planned, but then it got delayed. But the British had to be in control over what was happening.
And you have mentioned 3 stations that were in Gilgit region, right? Kindly name the 3. Well, they're in the book. In your book, you have mentioned.
One was called Tag Day, another one was called Beaver, and the third one I don't remember. And there was a 4th station that was also being set up in the Shaksgam Valley.
Yeah.
Which had a clear line of sight to Lopnor in Xinjiang.
So,
where the Chinese later on set up their testing site.
Broadly, there were 4 to 5 players internationally. 4 players. Americans, Russians, Brits, and Chinese.
America was not in the game. Was not in the game.
Okay.
It was Russia, Britain, and China.
Okay.
These were the three parties in the game.
Okay. Okay. So,
but primarily it was the British and the Russians.
Okay. Primarily, it was the British and the Russians. So, what about the Maharaja government? Was he aware of these international gaming that was happening in this region?
See, the Maharaja's government was run by three Englishmen.
Yeah.
One was the Major General, I forget his name now, who was
the state army chief. Then
who was in charge of the state army. Then there was Brigadier. There was Mr. Powell. There was Brigadier Powell, who was the police chief, and then there was this gentleman, Mr. Kak.
Yeah.
And there was one other person who was the agent of the government of India.
Yeah,
now, Mr. Kak was he had an English wife, so he was what you call a brown Englishman. So these people all had a plan of what to do with the state of Kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir, and they wanted to merge it into Pakistan. The Maharaja was not very sure, but he was very troubled because from the time of the advent of Sheikh Abdullah in the 1930s into Kashmiri politics, he was forced to introduce a constitution, and so he was trying to protect his kingdom, and he had grandiose designs of having an independent state along the lines of Switzerland that actually straddled Central Asia, but that didn't work out.
So what about Chandrakars? Because he is the person who has been less talked in the Kashmiri context, in the Kashmiri issue context. What about his role? What actually he wanted for Kashmir to happen? It's quite clear that he wanted Kashmir to merge with Pakistan. But what was his role with the government of India on the one side and with the Maharaja's government on the other side?
The government of India at that time was controlled by the British.
Yeah.
So he was effectively working for the implementation of the government of India's plans. Now, if the government of India's original plan was that they will hold on to Gilgit for 99 years from 1935 approximately, and Gilgit, there will be no political interference. There was just a small presence of the Kashmiri kingdom's administration in Gilgit, but rest of it was under the British control, the agent, and also the Gilgit scouts were under the control of British officers. So the Maharaja's writ never ran in Gilgit. It was only when they found, and the British were very meticulous about doing things legally, they found that, look, let us legally get hold of the entire Kashmir, because if it merges with Pakistan, then this Gilgit will be left behind with the government of India. Then what will happen to Gilgit? So relinquish the lease and join Gilgit with the Maharaja's kingdom as of the 31st of July 1947. And once it merges, that's what Prime Minister Kak was going to do. And Prime Minister Kak felt that the only access road into Kashmir was from the Rawalpindi side, the Muzaffarnagar belt. And the British were very worried that if the original boundary of Kashmir, which was the boundary of the Kingdom of Kashmir, was allowed to remain, then the Rawalpindi was only 30 kilometers away from that. So any artillery barrage would decimate Rawalpindi. So how could they then protect Rawalpindi? And Rawalpindi became very important because the Chaklala air base at Rawalpindi was the primary British air base that was doing reconnaissance flights over the Soviet Union and over the Soviet nuclear facilities.
You have mentioned about two air bases. One was Chaklala, other was in Karachi.
One was Risalpur
and Chaklala.
Yeah, Chaklala. So
at
the Chaklala air base, the British had got Polish pilots who were to form the nucleus of the Pakistan Air Force, and they were doing flights. Now, if there was going to be a war or a conflict, they could not let Rawalpindi be so vulnerable, so they had to also push the border back. So, which is why then they this whole thing about the so-called Azad Kashmir that came up in the Muzaffarpur Poonch area, which actually pushed the border back by quite a few kilometers into India and brought Rawalpindi out of the artillery range.
You have also mentioned that Nehru was about to hit both the airports, Chaklala as well as Risalpur. Am I right?
Who was about to hit them?
Nehru. It was on the Nehru's order. Nehru wanted to hit both the airports.
Yes, he wanted to hit them, but Mountbatten and the British senior military officers persuaded him.
They did not allow it. Yeah.
No, in fact, the British and then again the Americans in 1962 did not let us use our air force against the Chinese because they felt that would give us an advantage. And both times we were convinced to our folly or not to do so. I just brought that digression in because the influence of the British and the Americans was very strong in those days.
Coming back to this tribal raid, you have written in the book that on the both sides there were the British army officers leading both the armies, and it was again Nehru wanted to take the entire part of the Gilgit part of the Kashmir and the other side part of the Kashmir back, but it were the British generals who did not allow it, right?
Yes, because you see, Nehru felt that the Khan brothers in NWFP, who were leading the Congress party, this Badshah Khan and his brother, both of them were going to merge NWFP with India. The Khotai Khidmatgars.
Yeah.
The Khan brothers were going to merge with India. And what Mr. Nehru overlooked was the fact that the Sheikh Abdullah did not represent the whole of the Kashmir kingdom. Because Kashmir has 5 parts. There's the Gilgit and the vassal states. Then there's Ladakh. Then there's the Jammu region, then there's the valley, and then there's the Muzaffarpur Poonch belt. Now that entire Muzaffarpur belt is composed of Punjabi speakers. They don't speak Kashmiri. They're all Punjabis.
We will come back to Sheikh Abdullah a bit later. You talk about Nehru. How did the British scuttle Nehru's plan to take the entire Kashmir back?
See, there are 2 things you want to understand in this. One was that Nehru wanted to create this new concept of non-alignment. And in the concept of non-alignment, it could not be successful without Russian and Chinese cooperation. So for Nehru, non-alignment was very important. Secondly, he was misled into believing that Sheikh Abdullah could deliver the whole of Kashmir, whereas Sheikh Abdullah was only the leader of the valley, and he did not represent all the other 5 parts of Kashmir. So Nehru thought that if he supports Sheikh Abdullah, and he encourages Sheikh Abdullah, he will override Kak, he will override the Maharaja, and he will be able to ensure a Sheikh Abdullah-led government in Kashmir, which will then provide a land bridge to NWFP. But the British had other plans. They already had officers who were leading these Lashkars of the Kabelis in NWFP, who had resigned their commission from the British army, and who are going to lead these Pathans. Now, these Pathans, by race are very loyal to their leaders. They are willing to give their lives for them. So, when this Gilgit rebellion, which we'll come to later on, started under the aegis of Major William Brown, the British had to stand down the officers who were, leading the Kabelis. And they replaced the English officers with Punjabis. Now, Punjabis and Pathans don't get together. And the Pathans didn't want the Punjabis to lead them. So they went haywire, and that invasion was very haphazard. It did not actually perform in a disciplined manner.
Yeah.
As per the plans.
Yeah. Yes. You have also mentioned in your book that actually it was the British officer who wanted to lead it. But they had to, at the last very moment, they had to back out. And it was
they were not British officers. They had resigned their commissions. They were now British mercenaries.
Mercenaries. Okay, as you have written in the book, as you have mentioned in the book, that they were not even loyal to the king and to the British crown because of their.
On the surface, the British government was playing a very dubious role. It was actually working against the king and country and the British Parliament. So it was a very, you can say, a very realistic game. In Hindi, we say Kutniti. It was this kind of politics, real politics.
Very, very importantly, I want to ask you, in your book, you have also mentioned that it was under British actually planned it, that India did not sign the standstill agreement with the government of Jammu and Kashmir. When you have also mentioned about the Treaty of Amritsar. The government of India was bound to help the government of Jammu and Kashmir under the aegis of Treaty of Amritsar, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Kindly shed some light on this Treaty of Amritsar standstill agreement and the Nehru government refusing to sign the standstill agreement.
You see, now let's go back to the 1846 at the time of the Anglo-Sikh Wars, when in 7 years after the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was also the Emperor of Punjab, and he was the Emperor of Jammu and Kashmir, the British engineered the collapse of the Kingdom of Punjab. They actually eliminated all the heirs of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and they secured Punjab by the Treaty of Lahore and the Treaty
It was
of
with the
Amritsar.
help of Dogra Maharaja, the Gulab Singh.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. And they created Maharaja Gulab Singh as the overlord and Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir because they wanted a buffer between potential Soviet, not Soviet, but Russian expansionism into Kashmir, because the Russians were sending patrols trying to penetrate into this entire region because they wanted to expand the Russian Empire. So the British wanted a very cost-effective policy, and what happened was that the treasury of Punjab was looted, and that was taken by Maharaja Gulab Singh, and he paid it back to Rani Jindal, who then paid it as war reparations to the British. So the British got the money to pay for the Sikh wars. The treasury of Punjab was looted. A new kingdom was created, which was then a buffer between the British India and the Soviet Union. There was one buffer of Afghanistan, and there was a second buffer of the kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir. So that was created over there. Now the issue was that the standstill agreement was, Pandit Nehru was persuaded not to sign it, because if the standstill agreement had been signed, then India did not need to have this instrument of accession. We could have sent our army right in to save the Maharaja and save the state from the British-led Kabeli invasion.
If Nehru had accepted the standstill agreement.
Now we don't know. Nobody knows whether Nehru, what persuaded him not to sign the standstill agreement. What kind of
Mountbatten wasn't this Mountbatten who did stop Nehru actually?
My guess is that because you've read about that famous book by Dominique Lapierre and Larry Collins, Freedom at Midnight, and they say that Mountbatten claims that Nehru said, "You want to help us," and he formed a defense committee, and Mountbatten was the de facto ruler of the country. So the point is this, that Mountbatten was playing a very devious game, double game, a duplicitous game, because he was interested in ensuring that Britain became a nuclear power, because there was an existential crisis to Britain, that if the Soviet Union's bombers could bomb the UK and they had to have the bomb, the Americans were not willing to share the technology with the British. So they had to steal it from the Russians. And therefore, they convinced Panditji not to sign the standstill agreement, that Mountbatten was a primary person, given that logic. And therefore, the government of India could not legally go and help the Maharaja. However, Maharaja Patiala did send troops in, but it was too late, too little and too late.
We are terribly running off time, Mr. Malhotra. Last 9 minutes left. My last two questions, kindly be very brief with both the answers. You have also raised a question that maybe it was the Mountbatten or the British intelligence who did not wanted Sardar Patel to be the Prime Minister of India. It's an open-ended question in your book.
Well, I feel that if Sardar Patel had become the Prime Minister of India, then India would have joined the Western Alliance. And Sardar Patel's philosophy and his vision of India was identical with the vision of the British Raj. It was Pandit Nehru who actually had a different vision of India. So I think the British would have been happier if Sardar Patel had become Prime Minister than Mr. Nehru.
My last question, and it's an interesting question which I need to ask before we wind up this interesting discussion. In this entire setup, the international game that was being played out in Kashmir by the British, by the Soviets, and government of India, government of Pakistan, how little,
and China,
how little and how less was Sheikh Abdullah a player in this entire thing?
See, Sheikh Abdullah was encouraged and propped up by Pandit Nehru, because Pandit Nehru felt that he was the key to ensuring the land bridge between India and Northwest Frontier Province and India and the rest of Central Asia. And Nehru mistakenly believed that Sheikh Abdullah could deliver on that. But Sheikh Abdullah was not acceptable to all the other leadership of the other 5 different constituent parts of the state. And Nehru realized that the mistake he made when he virtually at the instance of the British had Sheikh Abdullah removed in 1953, after the unfortunate incident of the death of Shama Prasad Mukherjee and all the other incidents in the state. So effectively Nehru cut out Sheikh Abdullah from the game after 1953. However, he also banned the National Conference. However, he persuaded the Plebiscite Front, which was a new avatar of the Sheikh Abdullah of the National Conference under Mirza Afzal Beg, to function so that some political activity could be permitted. So by 1953, Sheikh Abdullah was out of the game. But the problem is that if you wanted to ensure the integrity of entire Kashmir, you had to accept that the valley is just one part of it. It's not Kashmir. Kashmir was much greater. The Kashmir's neighbors were China, Russia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan later on. So that's the wrong vision, or the perspective was completely different.
Two things that have come up from your answer. First, you have also mentioned in your book that why did there was no investigation as far as Shama Prasad Mukherjee's death was concerned in June 1953? Yeah, 1953. Why there was no investigation in the death of Shama Prasad Mukherjee?
I wish I knew the answer to that question.
I completely get it. And Sheikh Abdullah's arrest was also when Joe 4, when the Soviets launched Joe 4 in 1953. It coincided with the arrest of Sheikh Abdullah.
Actually, at that time, the Soviet task correspondent, N. Patsukov, I think his name, he was repeatedly flying in and out of Kashmir. And the British were very worried that tomorrow, if perchance Sheikh Abdullah declares UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, with recognition from the Soviet Union, then the British in Gilgit will be stuck between the Chinese in Xinjiang and the Soviets in the valley. So it will be a very difficult situation, and the whole structure would then collapse. So they told Nehru this thing and told him that, look, you have to ensure that this government is dismissed. And this is a fact that has been hidden. But the activities of the Russian intelligence through this Soviet guy, N. Patsukov, and the pro-Soviet loyalties of certain advisors of